This is Allison Thompson, the director at Marshall Public Library, representing the Friends of the Library's Oral History Project. And this morning I am speaking with Warren Strohm on November 16th, 2015. We are at Marshall Public Library in Marshall, Illinois. And Warren has a very rich history of Marshall that he's going to share with us. But Warren, I'm going to first ask you, when and where were you born?
I was born March the 4th, 1927. My parents' 40-acre farm had a nice two-story house on it. I was born at home. I had a doctor attending. My birth was Dr. Highsmith out of West Union. Mm-hmm. And everything went well, I guess. So here I am, 88 years later, prepared to tell you some things about my life.
Great.
And I will make a few blunders, but I guess everybody does that.
That's very normal.
And so, Allison, I appreciate this opportunity. In fact, my youngest son and his wife has been pushing me to do this for 3 years or more. In fact, they bought me a recording device and a whole box full of tapes. Guess how many of them I've used? I think one of them. Mm-hmm. So, but I guess it's no fun sitting there at home talking to myself. And so you've invited me to this great library that we have here in the city of Marshall, which it's fantastic, and I appreciate it very much. So I'll try not to stutter too much, maybe a little bit, but we'll just go from there.
Well, it's my honor.
Oh, thank you very much. I was born, and my parents named me Warren Ames Strohm. The Warren came from a farm family down below West Union that my father was acquainted with, and he liked the name. The gentleman was, I think, deceased before I was born, but he liked the name Warren, so I got that tag. Now, where they come up with the Ames, I don't know. I use the middle initial A, but I don't tell very many people what my middle name is. It sounds. It was very, very appropriate. I say when I was just a kid. Mm-hmm. It went with Warren Ames. A lot of my friends and so on used it then, but I've taken a few kidding, quite a bit of kidding about it in later years, and that's all right. I've enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. I guess I got a little tension, didn't I? But then my dad was Fred Truman Strohm. My mother was Esther Lydia Schaefer was her maiden name, and the reason I don't feel bad about trying to that I disregard my middle name Ames was my dad. Like I just mentioned, I believe his middle initial was Truman. Well, from the first one, some of the first recollections I have about national individuals and so on was Truman, our President Truman from Missouri, who took over after President Roosevelt, I believe, passed away there in the early 30s. And back then, politics, people were very, very proud of their politics, what they stood for. but you was either a Republican or a Democrat. There was very few in between. And so my father did not use he used the name Fred T. And I guess that's the reason why I've been using, for years I've used Warren A. That's kind of beside the point. But anyhow, both my parents was of German ancestry, and I'm kind of proud they were, because I inherited some abilities from my family that I'm kind of proud of. I would like to say that my great grandparents, I'd like to touch base with them, give them credit, because let's face it, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here today. My grandpa, Henry Strohm, was born on January the 6th, 1865. He passed away at the age of 59 in 1924. My grandma, Strohm, her name was Mary Elizabeth Strohm. Her maiden name was Blizzard. There was a lot of family by the name of Blizzard around West Union back in the early 20s. Fine people. She was born December 17th, 1867, and she lived to be 88. She passed away on December 31st of 1958. My grandma Schaefer, her maiden name was Mundorf, and there were several Mundorfs in Darwin Township at that time, and they were fine people. She was born on September the 18th of 1859. She reached the age of 71, passed away on December 19th, 1930. My grandpa Schaefer, his first name was Frederick. Frederick Schaefer. He was born October 25th, 1850. Lived to the age of 75, which wasn't too bad back in those days. He passed away January 30th, 1925. Since I was born in 1927, I knew my grandpa Strohm a lot better, of course, because she lived to be 1958, and we she was a very gracious lady. My grandma Schaefer, she lost her husband in 1925, and shortly thereafter, if I remember properly, she came to live with my parents as kids. And I have one vivid recollection of her during that time. We had we lived in a two-story home, and of course it didn't know what the central heating and air was at that time. So it had the main, we had a front room, and then a two-story room above that was a bedroom, of course. And in order to get the heat upstairs, somebody just cut a opening in the floor and put a little grating there, and that was right over the main heating stove, which was a coal stove, and heated that room. So that's where my grandma Schaefer stayed with us until she passed away in 1930. But what I can vividly remember, I could see it yet today. She had it looked like something about like a cigar box, and she had some hard candy in that, and I don't know, and so she called my two sisters and me in one day, and she would give us some of that candy. She gave us some of that candy. But the candy box, she she apparently had used that for a while. The inside of that candy box was all red from the hard candies, and I could still see that red. Now that's really, and that's my first recollection of life. Quite frankly, of course, I was almost 4 when she passed away, I guess. So I guess it was time that but I didn't remember much before that. Then I did remember kind of vaguely that she lived with us when she took sick. My sister June lives out east of Tam Marshall here. She keeps track of all these statistics, and as she follows our histories, all of not only before us, but a lot of all of our children in our family. She's got records of everybody, and that's just great. But she said that our grandma Schaefer got sick from a gallstone attack, and she suffered an awful lot. She said before she passed away. But I do remember a few instances when she was extremely sick, and it wasn't a very pleasant time back in those days because the doctors didn't have the pain pills and so on and so forth that we have today. So anyhow, that's kind of the story on my grandparents and great grandparents, and they were, of course, lived. My grandparents Schaefer, they lived down in the Ernest south of Marshall, the Ernest area, and there was the train, north and south train ran through that little burg. One time there was a store there, I guess, but I don't remember that. But anyhow, they lived in a farm, a big 2-story house, not a large one, but they lived a mile off the main road, and that main road from back to their house was nothing but mud road. It was a mud road, and it never got hard surface, graveled or hard surface until, oh gosh, when I was a teenager, if I'm not mistaken. But they just kept a team of horses and wagon ready to go for that first mile, and thank goodness they didn't have too many emergencies. I guess they could go to town and get what victuals they had to have. So anyhow, let's see, where am I at now? I want to talk about my grandma and grandpa Strohm. Grandfather Henry was a small farmer out in rural West Union. He was, of course, didn't know what tractors were in those days. He used horses, and he had quite a bit of help because he had five sons, so he should have had a lot of help. My dad became very, very familiar with how to handle horses at an early age, and it helped him considerably when he was inducted into the Army. Of the 9 children that my grandparents Strohms had, there were 5 sons and 4 girls, as stated, and my father was right in the middle. He was the 4th. He was the middle of the 5 sons, and the middle. They had 2 sisters older and 2 sisters younger, or whatever that might mean. I don't know, but it was just what turned out. All 4 of these, or all 9, these children grew to adulthood, except one of the girls, I think, had some health problems and she passed away. I'm not real sure, but probably in her 30s sometime. So that back in in that area of raising a family, I'm sure my mother Elizabeth, my grandmother Mary Elizabeth, was a hard worker and to take care of a family of that size. Mm-hmm. I have a story concerning my grandfather Strohm. Like I said, he was just a tenant farmer, rented all the land that he farmed, and most of it was East-West Union on the sand, what we call the sand prairie, where it depended. The crops are very dependent upon the natural rainwater. Back at that time, they're now all that area is covered by irrigation, and which is fantastic because they can with fertilizer and so on, they can plant their crops on the sandy. They can get their crops planted on time and then put the water to them, and which is not cheap to do that, but it raises, generally speaking, it will raise a good crop. My grandfather, I suppose, never as I can recall, he never farmed over 40 acres, which that was with horsepower, that was quite a bit. Probably sometimes it was less than that, and he moved around somewhat, I'm sure. Maybe he didn't please the landlord, I don't know, but anyhow, he was farming east there on the sand, and in the teens, and in the year 1918 was a very wet spring. It just rained and rained and rained, and fortunately, by being on the sand, my grandfather, my dad said he helped him put out the crops that spring, and he got his corn, particularly his corn, and planted in time. And of course, they cultivated. Thought then they had to cultivate corn 2 or 3 times to keep the weeds down. That's the way they had to keep them under control. And then my father joined the military, joined the army, and then the summer of 1918, he volunteered. He joined a reserve group or a group from Terre Haute, Indiana. There were mostly Hoosiers in that original group that where they put together, but he took a very sharp basic here and the States, I'm sure, and then he was put aboard a troop ship, which back in those days was nothing but an old freighter with bunk beds and kitchens put in, and he landed in I'm not sure where he landed, but he fought in that World War I in France, and he was with an artillery group. It didn't take the commanders long to find out that he was very familiar with how to handle horses, and of course all the artillery at that time was when they got ready to move it, hopefully to advance. They used horsepower, and so he spent 18 months in that front, and mostly in France, I think it was, in World War I, and came back a pretty good man, except back in World War One, there was mustard gas used to disarm the opposition, and his lungs became scarred from that gas, and unfortunately, it never bothered him too much. But anytime he had an X-ray made of his lungs, the doctors became perturbed real fast because they were not at least bit clear. So, and he helped my grandfather put this crop out in the spring of 1918. But the farmers that were out on the clay areas with clay soil, they did not get their particular corn crop in until way late in the spring. And that fall, they had the farmers on the clay harvested their crop, but it was not fit for seed corn. It's kind of course, back then there was no such thing as a seed corn company. They were non-existent. That had materials that hadn't come on yet. So what you did, you simply went to your corn crib and picked out what you thought was your best ear of corn, and then you shelled that by hand, and that was what you used to put through your two-row planter most of the time. So my grandpa Strohm had a little bit of luck, if you want to call it that. His corn matured and made a good seed corn that fall, and for the next spring, he was able to sell corn. Corn was I remember back in my childhood days, corn was sold for 10 or 15 cents a bushel, or even less. Well, since everybody was actually needing seed corn for the spring season in the 1919, my grandfather sold most of his crop out of the crib for $2.50 a bushel.
Wow!
Now, maybe that sounds like a lot, and in those days that was a lot. But he probably wasn't the only one, because he didn't farm all the sand. So that was a going price in those days there. And needless to say, that counted up as far as dollars in the bank, or that counted up pretty fast. And so what my grandfather was, let's see, he was born in. He was born in 1865, so he was 35. He was 50 years of age, give or take, and of course he never owned a bit of property up until that time. But he was able to take proceeds from his sale of his seed corn, and he bought 40-acre farm just west of West Union with a nice little house on it, and a barn and chick cows, and that's where he lived until he passed away, and they were very proud of it.
That's a great story.
I remember, Allison, I remember one incident that happened on that little farm. My grandmother still lived out there, and her the hen house, or the whatever it was, the roof had deteriorated to the point where it needed a new roof put on. So my father and perhaps one of his brothers helped. They met out there one day, and I wasn't in school yet, so I went along to tag along, of course. And the roof on that building had deteriorated to the point that it wasn't safe to be up on. But they proceeded to do the best they could, and I'm pretty sure it was my dad or one of his brothers. The roof gave way and they fell inside the house, and they tried to catch themselves somewhere there, and it broke one of their fingers, and the bone was sticking out, and of course it's pretty bloody. I guess I remember that because there was red blood and pretty kind of an exciting time. I had never seen anything like that, and thank goodness I've never experienced too many times like that before. Since then, I have never came upon an accident or a home accident where there's been a lot of blood involved, and I'm glad I haven't. So anyhow, that was a strict luck that my grandpa Strohm had, and it certainly helps in life if a person can have some help of some type, whether it be from the neighbors or just a coincidence. I'm very happy. First of all, I started this recording, and I said I was 88 years old, and I forgot one thing. I'm very grateful that I have lived to be this age, and have had a very good life. Good wife. My wife and I have been married 68 years, and our 4 children are all doing well, and they have nice families, and we are very grateful for that. Allison, I want to regress a little bit in time and tell you about a little incident that happened when my father and most of his brothers and sisters were still living on the small farm where my grandpa had rented. Since my dad was in the middle of the 5 boys, the 2 younger brothers, they somehow or other, there was wildlife in that area as well as there is today, probably a lot more of it. And his 2 younger brothers, there was a skunk came to their house, and they thought the skunk was pretty nice, cute, and so they adopted this skunk as a pet, and they got along pretty well with this until their mother decided that they hadn't had any accidents up to that time with this skunk putting out his perfume, if you want to call it that. So she told them that they were just going to have to get rid of that skunk. And so my Uncle Jess was the youngest of the 5 boys, and my Uncle Cash was the next. And so they reluctantly took their pet skunk down the road, a short distance from the house. I'm not just sure where, but anyhow, they attempted to tell their pet skunk that they didn't want him anymore. And he liked to hang around the house. There he probably got some scraps to eat. And so in the process, here's how they attempt to do that. My Uncle Jess took his cap off his head and attempted to beat the skunk over his back a little bit to get it to leave. Well, it didn't like that too well. So what do you think happened? It shot my Uncle Jess with its defendant perfume, and was used, I guess, to protect itself. And not only did the skunk spray him with its odor, but since he was beating it, he was trying to get rid of it using his cap. Well, he had got his cap first done, and with the most of its perfume. So then the boys turned around and headed for home, and Uncle Jess, he just put his cap back on his head. And the end of the story, when he got to the house, wasn't too good. I'm sure that his mother was a little unhappy. And so my dad said, back in those days they didn't have the detergents that we got today, and I think my Uncle Jess maybe had to stay out with the skunk for a day or two, and she liked to. My grandma liked to never get that stink out of that cap. We were, of course, I was born in 27. As I was told, the years of the 20s was pretty good times in this country. Everybody was had raising vegetables and farm crops and so on and so forth, and so. But it was people did not. Maybe they went to town once a week, if possible, to get what vegetables and victuals they had to have. But we were a pretty close family on both sides, my mother and father. And since most of my family came from West Union, we were closest to West Union and mileage-wise. And, well, quite frankly, where I was born was about a half a mile west of the little burg of Snyder. And how we happened to get there on this 40-acre farm was my father, I guess, liked to. He worked as a farmhand for his brother-in-law, my mother's brother Aaron, farmed down on the sand, and his brother Perry Strohm farmed down there on the sand east of Walnut Prairie, and he worked for them for a while, and then in the it must have been about in the late teens or early 20s. There was the sheriff's office was held by a gentleman by the name of Brian, I believe it was, and for some reason he must have liked my father, and he put him on as a deputy. And my father was deputy sheriff, and that was a position that I guess you got a lot of. Naturally seen quite a few people because you worked in town. My parents lived on North 5th Street here in Marshall, and in the second block on the east side there, the little house is still standing. And so, believe it or not, Allison, back in those days, there was only one deputy for the whole county. There was only one deputy. So anyhow, it came time for election, and his boss, the sheriff, decided not to run again. So my father got the nomination somehow or other as on the Republican candidate for sheriff. That was in the late teens, early 20s, at that time. Well, he wasn't, since he was just a young person and probably wasn't well known in the west side of the county at all. He was defeated for his quest to become sheriff. His opposition was a Democrat here that lived there in Marshall. I believe his name was Holscher or something. He has relatives still here. No, I'm sorry. That was a sheriff before. He ran against a gentleman by the name of Coldren, and lives down in the various parts of town. Helen Moore was one of his daughters. They were nice. They were very, very fine people. and he had a son by the name of son. I forget what his name was. Mrs. Elias was one of his daughters, and I forget him. Can't recall the name of the rest of them right now. But anyhow, my dad's uncle lived on this farm, this 40-acre farm. Ben. Oh shoot, can't think of it then. But anyhow, he had built this home on this 40 acres, and my dad made arrangements and bought that off of my uncle. The home wasn't really too old, and it was 40 acres in size, but it was not really designed for well, there was about half of it or better was tillable, but my dad did not own a big layout of farm equipment, so he used this farm for raising livestock, mostly hogs, and he always had a big garden, a big group of hogs. He fed them with he bought quite a bit of his feed in town, or had a ground here in town here by the Marshall Co-op was down there where the 911 building is now, and he would mix up ground feed and water and make a slop. Of course, hogs love eat slop, and anyhow. That's we never lacked. We always had a big garden, and we had a patch behind the house that my folks had. My dad had a big area of raspberries, and they were fine fruit. But us kids got involved very much in picking those raspberries. Well. And of course we probably canned some of them down our stomach while we were picking. The biggest problem with that picking the raspberries was there was tigers galore in those raspberry bushels, and my God, they would get all over your arms or your face and your private parts, and it wasn't funny at all. There was very much we had very little type of medicines to fight those. But we had a fine time. We had a great time. Like I said a while ago, our families were both pretty close knit, and you had no television or we had telephones. But they were the old type of family lines where there were 6 or 8 people on the family line, on the party line, and you're very fortunate if you could really get a signal, because they had more people that had the receivers off, but the less strong, the weaker the signal was. But when I remember very distinctly going to West Union when I was just at grade school, and my Uncle Jess operated a small restaurant right on where the Route 1 tees off and goes up to the east there through the part of West Union town, and he operated that for quite a while. So he served ice cream and soda pop. He had a soda pop cooler that was an antique, or would be a terrific. It was an antique back then, I think. But you took a big chunk of ice, and this thing was made kind of like a table, but it had it was made out of aluminum or probably polished metal. And it had a track. Of course, everything came in. So the soda pop came in bottles, glass bottles, and they had a track where you would push a bottle in one side, and that track went down underneath the bed of ice, which that's how it cooled. And then you push one bottle in or fill that whole track up, and then if you push the bottle in one side, the bottle would pop out the other side. And of course, it would be cold, or else you keep feeding that through until you did get a cold bottle, a soda bottle. And the best I remember, they were a whole 5 cents. 5 cents. But that was it was a treat to go to West Union, because West Union was a pretty thriving town. My one of my aunts, in fact, I guess probably it was my Aunt Esther. She was the youngest of the family. She worked for a gentleman by the name of Charlie Cornwell, and he had a dry goods store in West Union. He sold overalls, shirts, and so on and so forth. And she worked for him. She went to work for him. Well, he was quite a bit older than she was, but they ended up getting married. And they had a family of their own. And best I remember, they had 2 or 3 daughters and one son. Caroline Cornwell, who was in the courthouse here, a treasurer in the courthouse for a number of years, and in fact, she's still living. That was one of their children. And the youngest one was Hilda, and she went to school, and she was the youngest in her family, and she was born with only one hand, and just a stub on the other hand. And I never will forget when she was born. The general consensus was that she was with that type of disability, she was just going to have an awful time doing anything in that day and age. But she went to school, educated herself, and retired from the grade schools in Paris, and still lives up there part of the time. Or else, I believe she lives in Melrose. And but we used to visit on my mother's side at the old farmhouse, where you had to go back the mile of muddy roads. Needless to say, in the spring we didn't go very often. That's about all I've got for today, Allison, and I hope it was not boring to you or to anyone else, and we'll try to do this again. Okay?
Thank you, Warren.
Bye. Bye now.